My husband brought his 24-year-old secretary to a high-profile corporate gala and told me not to overreact. So I brought my male assistant, let him fix my diamond necklace right in front of everyone, and said the exact same thing to him. Do not overreact. He is just my assistant. Elliot's smile froze so hard I almost heard his ego shatter. My name is Valerie. I am 34 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to put a toxic partner in their exact place. The evening was supposed to be a celebration of Elliot's firm, marking its 40th anniversary. The ballroom in Buckhead was draped in opulence filled with Atlanta's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over wealth managers, real estate tycoons, and socialites. I had arrived early to ensure our reserved table was perfectly arranged, wearing a classic black evening gown that commanded respect without screaming for attention. I expected my husband to walk through those grand double doors and take his place beside me. Instead, Elliot strolled into the ballroom with his secretary Sienna clinging to his arm. Sienna was wearing a plunging backless red silk gown with a slit so high it defied the basic dress code of a corporate event. She looked less like a professional assistant and more like a woman arriving for a romantic rendezvous. The whispers started immediately. I could feel the eyes of other wives and executives darting between me sitting alone at the VIP table and Elliot parading his secretary across the room. I stood up, smoothing my dress, and intercepted them before they could reach the center of the room. I asked Elliot what exactly he thought he was doing, bringing his secretary as his +1 to a formal dinner when his wife was already here. Elliot did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He adjusted his expensive tie, looked down at me with absolute condescension, and sighed loudly. Do not overreact, Valerie, he said, his voice dripping with annoyance. She is just my secretary. I need her here to take notes during the keynote speeches. Act like a supportive wife for once instead of a struggling party planner. Do not embarrass me tonight. Sienna stood there offering a sickly sweet smile, entirely unapologetic. I looked at Elliot. We had been married for 5 years. 5 years of him minimizing my career, treating my business like a cute little hobby, and asserting his financial superiority at every turn. He thought I was just an event planner who arranged balloons and ordered catering. He had no idea that my lifestyle concierge firm managed the deepest secrets, private estates, and dark money of the exact billionaires he spent his life trying to impress. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink in his face. I simply smiled, nodded, and pulled out my phone. I sent a single text message. Then I stepped aside and told Elliot to enjoy his evening. 15 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open again. The murmurs in the room suddenly shifted tone, turning into a low hum of genuine curiosity and admiration. I turned around to see Julian walking toward me. Julian was 28 years old, a former ruthless corporate attorney who now worked as my right-hand man. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored Tom Ford suit that fit his athletic frame flawlessly. With his striking features and absolute air of authority, he commanded the room the second he stepped inside. He walked straight past Elliot, completely ignoring him, and stopped right in front of me. With a smooth, practiced motion, Julian stepped intimately close, his presence immediately enveloping my space. He reached behind my neck, his fingers brushing lightly against my skin, and adjusted the clasp of my diamond necklace. There you go, he murmured, his voice low but loud enough to carry. Perfect as always, Valerie. The entire VIP section was watching. Elliot abandoned Sienna instantly, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He stormed over to our table, his chest puffed out, looking like he was ready to throw a punch. What the hell do you think you are doing? Elliot demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained rage as he glared at Julian. Who is this guy? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. I looked Elliot directly in the eyes and mirrored his exact tone from earlier. Do not overreact, Elliot, I said, clearly making sure the executives at the next table could hear every word. He is just my assistant. Are you really insecure over a man on my payroll? Elliot froze. His mouth opened but no words came out. The executives nearby chuckled behind their drinks. Sienna looked completely abandoned near the bar. Julian simply offered Elliot a polite, razor-sharp smile, completely unbothered by my husband's fragile ego. Before Elliot could find his voice to argue, a sharp hand grabbed my upper arm. I turned to see my mother-in-law, Vivian. She was draped in heavy pearls and furious indignation. Vivian was the quintessential image-obsessed matriarch of Atlanta high society, a woman who cared more about country club appearances than basic human decency. She did not say a word to her son about his half-dressed secretary. Instead, she yanked my arm and demanded I follow her to the restroom immediately. Julian stepped forward to intervene, but I held up my hand. I told him to hold my drink and followed Vivian into the lavish marble-lined women's lounge. The moment the heavy door swung shut, Vivian unleashed years of suppressed resentment. She paced the length of the vanity, her heels clicking aggressively against the tile. "What is wrong with you?" Vivian hissed, her eyes blazing. "Elliot should never have married a public school girl who plays with balloons for a living. You are embarrassing this family's legacy. My son is a senior wealth manager. He needs a woman who is flexible, sophisticated, and knows how to navigate diplomacy. Not some petty decorator who brings a hired boy toy to a corporate gala to cause a scene." Tasha was right. You will never belong in our world. I did not shrink away. I walked over to the gilded sink, turned on the warm water, and began washing my hands. The contrast between her frantic, vein-popping rage and my absolute calm only seemed to infuriate her more. "Are you even listening to me?" Vivian demanded. "You are a liability to Elliot's career." I turned off the water. I reached for a thick paper towel, drying my hands, meticulously taking my time. Then I turned to face my mother-in-law. "I am listening, Vivian," I said smoothly. "But before you talk to me about legacy and embarrassment, let us discuss your spring gala charity, the one you just spent 20 minutes bragging about on the podium outside." Vivian frowned, her posture stiffening. "What about my charity?" I tossed the paper towel into the brass bin. "I know your charity has been secretly bankrupt for 2 years. I know you have been desperately hosting luncheons trying to cover the deficit, so the board does not strip you of your presidency. And I know that last month an anonymous benefactor wired a prestigious $150,000 grant that saved you from public ruin." Vivian scoffed, crossing her arms. "Yes, a wealthy admirer of my philanthropic work, something you know nothing about." I took a step closer to her, dropping my voice to a lethal calm. "That wealthy admirer was me, Vivian. That money was wired directly from my corporate holding account. I funded your little socialite hobby because I did not want my husband's mother looking like a fraud in the local papers." The color drained from Vivian's face. The smug, elitist superiority vanished in a single second, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth, but her voice was completely gone. "So here is how this works." I continued, leaning in just slightly. "You are going to walk back out. You are going to smile at my assistant, and you are going to keep your mouth shut about my marriage. Bite your tongue, Vivian, or I will cut the funding tomorrow morning and let your country club friends know you are completely broke." I did not wait for her response. I turned on my heel, pushed open the heavy restroom door, and walked back out into the glittering ballroom, leaving my mother-in-law paralyzed with shock in front of the vanity mirrors. I found Julian waiting exactly where I left him, holding my glass of champagne. The night was just beginning, and my family had no idea they had finally pushed me to play my hand. The ride back to our sprawling Buckhead estate was suffocatingly tense. The sound of the luxury car tires humming against the dark asphalt was the only noise competing with Elliot's heavy, furious breathing. He gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned a pale shade of gray. I sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through my phone, completely unbothered. I was finalizing a secure wire transfer for a high-profile client in Geneva. But to Elliot, I was simply ignoring his outrage. He slammed his hand against the dashboard, making the vehicle swerve slightly before regaining control. "Are you completely out of your mind, Valerie?" He snapped, his voice vibrating with unchecked rage. "You bring a hired hand to my firm's anniversary gala, let him touch you in front of my senior partners, and then you have the audacity to disrespect my mother. You humiliated my entire family tonight." I simply tapped send on the financial transfer and locked my phone. "Your mother humiliated herself, Elliot. And you humiliated our marriage the second you walked through those double doors with a 24-year-old secretary dressed for a nightclub." Elliot let out a harsh, condescending laugh. "Sienna is a dedicated employee. She is young, eager to learn wealth management, and respects my authority. You live in a fantasy world, Valerie. You think because you arrange floral centerpieces and book caterers for local birthdays that you understand how real power works. You are a party planner playing dress up in my world. He had no idea that I was the one who actually owned the chessboard. Since you want to act like an independent, powerful woman, Elliot continued, his voice dripping with malice, I am going to give you exactly what you want. Tomorrow morning, I am calling American Express. I am canceling every supplementary credit card in your wallet. The platinum card, the black card, all of it. Your little event planning business barely clears enough to pay for your shoes. Let us see how bold you feel when you have to buy your own gas. It is time to teach you a painful lesson in financial dependence. I let a small, genuine smile touch my lips. I did not argue. I simply closed my eyes and let him enjoy his fragile delusion of absolute control. The next morning, the bright sun baked the pavement outside an exclusive coffee shop in Midtown. It was where the city's financial elite gathered before heading into the high-rise office buildings. At exactly 8:30, Elliot would be standing at the marble counter with three of his senior colleagues, bragging about portfolio returns. According to the text message I received from Julian, who was monitoring the situation perfectly, from across the street, the scene played out exactly as anticipated. Elliot leaned against the counter in his bespoke Italian suit, generously offering to cover the tab for his colleagues. He pulled out his sleek metal black card with a practiced flick of his wrist and slid it proudly across the marble to the barista. But the machine let out a sharp negative beep. The barista frowned and ran the card again. Another sharp beep. I am sorry, sir, the barista said, raising his voice just enough to cut through the corporate conversation. The card is declining. Elliot stopped mid-sentence. His colleagues went completely silent. Elliot let out a nervous chuckle, his face flushing red, demanding they run it again. The machine beeped a third time, flashing a bright red error message indicating the account was permanently frozen by the primary cardholder. One of Elliot's colleagues, a senior partner known for his ruthless judgment, raised an eyebrow and slowly pulled out his own wallet. Do not worry about it, Elliot. I will cover it. Having some cash flow issues at home. The humiliation hit Elliot like a freight train. He snatched his card off the counter, muttered a frantic excuse about bank fraud alerts, and practically sprinted out of the coffee shop. He threw himself onto the sidewalk, his hands shaking as he dialed my number. I was sitting in my actual office when the phone rang. It was not the pastel-colored storefront with balloon displays that I maintained as a decoy. My real office was a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse suite in downtown Atlanta, secured by biometric scanners. Julian was sitting across from my desk, reviewing an acquisition contract. When Elliot's name flashed on my screen, Julian smirked. I answered on the fourth ring, keeping my tone light. Good morning, Elliot. Did you enjoy your coffee? Valerie. What did you do? Elliot screamed into the receiver. I am standing in front of my senior partners and my black card just declined. Fix this now. I told you I was going to cut your cards today, not the other way around. I leaned back in my leather chair. I am afraid I cannot do that, Elliot. What do you mean? I am the primary earner in this marriage. I bring in the money. Fix it now or I swear to God. I cut him off, my voice dropping to a freezing authority. Elliot, take a deep breath and finally pay attention to the details you arrogantly ignore. Did you ever actually read the fine print on the mortgage documents for our estate? The lease agreements for your luxury cars? The routing numbers for the joint accounts? There was dead silence on the other end of the line. Let me spell it out for you, I continued smoothly. You do not own the house. You do not own the cars. And you do not own that black card. Every single asset is legally registered under Apex Lifestyle Holdings. That is an LLC of which I am the sole founder, CEO, and primary shareholder. I let the reality shatter his mind. For 5 years, I had quietly structured everything under my corporate umbrella to protect my assets from his massive ego. He was so busy looking down on my event planning business that he never realized the documents I handed him legally bound him to my financial empire. You wanted to teach me a lesson in financial dependence, Elliot? I asked, my voice echoing in my massive office. Consider the lesson taught. I locked your card. I froze your access to the joint accounts. You have exactly $0 to your name right now. Valerie, please. Elliot stammered, his voice trembling with raw panic. My car keys are in my pocket, but the garage app is not working. How am I supposed to get to the office? I smiled, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. Call an Uber, I said. And then I hung up the phone. I set my phone face down on the polished mahogany desk and took a slow, deep breath. The silence in my penthouse office was absolute, but I knew the shockwave of what I had just done was already ripping through my husband's fragile reality. Elliot was predictable. He was a man who relied entirely on the perceived power of his title and the backing of his wealthy family. Stripped of his black card and his luxury vehicle, he would not reflect on his own mistakes. He would immediately seek reinforcements. I knew exactly who he was calling at this very moment. He was crying to his older sister Tasha and her husband Bradley. Tasha had despised me from the moment Elliot brought me to their sprawling family estate for Sunday dinner. Tasha considered herself the ultimate gatekeeper of Atlanta high society. She had married Bradley, a ruthless old money white real estate developer, and viewed their union as the absolute elevation of her social status. Bradley loved to use his racial privilege and his massive commercial property portfolio to patronize everyone in Elliot's family, but he saved his most concentrated condescension for me. He loved to pat me on the shoulder at Thanksgiving dinners, asking how my little party planning hobby was holding up in this tough economy, offering to let me decorate his corporate lobbies for exposure. They were the perfect attack dogs for Elliot. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and told Julian to gather the Vanguard credit files. I told him I was heading down to the storefront and that he should follow me in exactly 30 minutes. It was time to play the role of the struggling event planner one last time. My driver dropped me off in front of the pastel pink awning of Valerie's Events and Floral Design. The boutique was situated in a trendy, high-foot traffic neighborhood. Through the large glass windows, you could see towering displays of silk hydrangeas, racks of imported velvet ribbons, and beautifully arranged tablescapes. It was a meticulously crafted decoy. No one walking past this aggressively cheerful storefront would ever suspect that the back office contained a secure server room routing millions of dollars for political fixers and corporate billionaires. I walked inside, the bell above the door jingling merrily. I told my two front desk receptionists to take an extended paid lunch break. They happily grabbed their bags and left me completely alone in the shop. I sat down at the small white reception desk, folded my hands over a stack of wedding catering brochures, and waited. It did not take long. Barely 20 minutes had passed when the front door was kicked open with such violent force that the glass rattled in its frame. The cheerful bell jingled wildly. Bradley stormed into my boutique, tracking dirty footprints across my pristine white rugs. He was a tall, heavy-set man who wore his expensive golf attire like a uniform of superiority. His face was flushed with the kind of indignant rage reserved for men who were entirely unaccustomed to being told no. He did not bother to greet me. He did not even wipe his feet. Bradley marched straight up to my reception desk, pulled a thick legal document from his leather portfolio, and slammed it down onto the glass surface right over my catering brochures. The sharp crack echoed through the empty shop. He leaned his heavy knuckles on my desk, invading my personal space, his breath smelling faintly of morning scotch and entitlement. He looked down at me with a sneer that twisted his features into something deeply ugly. My firm just bought this entire commercial building this morning. Bradley gloated, his voice booming through the quiet boutique. The closing papers were rushed through an hour ago. And as the new owner of this property, my very first executive action is terminating your month-to-month lease. You are out, Valerie. I looked down at the document. It was a standard commercial eviction notice filled with aggressive legal jargon designed to intimidate small business owners. I did not touch the paper. I simply looked back up at Bradley, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. "Is that so, Bradley?" I asked, my voice calm and even. "You rushed a commercial real estate closing just to hand me an eviction notice before lunchtime. Elliot called us crying." Bradley spat his face, turning an even deeper shade of red. "He told us about your little stunt at the gala last night. He told us how you locked him out of his own bank accounts this morning. You have lost your damn mind if you think you can treat my brother-in-law like that and face no consequences. Elliot is family. Tasha has been in hysterics all morning because of your blatant disrespect. Bradley stood up straight, crossing his thick arms over his chest, attempting to physically dominate the room. You forgot your place in this city, Valerie. He continued, his tone dripping with racial and classist condescension. You married into a family of status, and instead of being grateful, you want to bite the hand that feeds you. You do not disrespect Elliot and think you can survive in my city. I control the commercial real estate in this district. I hold the keys. You have exactly 3 days to pack up your cheap balloons, your fake flowers, and your little ribbons. If you are not out of this building by Friday morning, I will have the sheriff drag you out by your hair, and I will throw your inventory into the dumpsters out back. I remained seated, resting my chin on my hands. Bradley was practically vibrating with the thrill of putting me in my place. He genuinely believed he had just destroyed my entire livelihood with a single piece of paper. He believed his white privilege and his real estate portfolio made him an untouchable god in my world. Are you going to cry? Valerie Bradley taunted, leaning back down, a cruel, satisfied grin spreading across his face. Because calling your little assistant to fix your necklace is not going to save your business today. You should have stayed in your lane. Now you are going to learn what happens when you play games with real money. Call some movers. You are done. Bradley turned on his heel, fully expecting me to burst into tears and beg for a lease extension. He reached for the door handle, ready to storm out and call Elliot with the good news of my total destruction. But I did not cry. I did not beg. Instead, I let a soft, genuine laugh escape my lips. Bradley stopped, his hand freezing on the brass door handle. He turned back around, his cruel smile faltering slightly as he saw the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. I was not looking at him anymore. I was looking past his shoulder, watching the heavy velvet curtain at the back of the boutique slide open. Julian was stepping out from the secure server room carrying a red-stamped financial dossier that was about to turn Bradley's arrogant world into a living, breathing nightmare. Julian bypassed the displays of imported silk hydrangeas with the lethal grace of an apex predator. He wore a charcoal-tailored suit, making Bradley's expensive country club attire look sloppy by comparison. Bradley puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical size to assert dominance over the small space. He sneered, pointing an aggressive finger at Julian, and barked that he did not speak to hired help. He demanded Julian fetch him a cup of black coffee and leave the real business owners to talk. Julian did not even blink. He did not acknowledge the blatant disrespect or the racial undertone hanging thickly in the quiet boutique. He simply walked straight up to my white reception desk and dropped a heavy leather-bound folder directly on top of the eviction notice Bradley had slammed down moments earlier. The folder bore a bright red confidential stamp across its cover. I stood up, letting the cheerful party planner persona evaporate entirely. The polite smile I used to appease Elliot's family melted away, replaced by the calculating expression I reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. I looked Bradley directly in the eyes. His arrogant grin faltered as he registered the sharp shift in my posture. You really believe this pink storefront is the extent of my ambition, Bradley? I asked, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling register. You have spent 5 years bringing your old money arrogance into my home and laughing at my little hobby. Let me properly introduce myself. Julian flipped open the leather folder. He began passing pristine watermarked financial documents across the glass desk. This storefront is a decoy, I explained, watching Bradley's eyes dart down to the dense legal text. My actual business is a highly secure private equity firm and lifestyle concierge service for the global elite. I manage offshore accounts, orchestrate corporate crisis cleanups, and handle the dark money your wealthy friends desperately need to hide. I am the shadow that keeps this city running while men like you pretend to hold the reins. Bradley let out a loud, forced bark of laughter. He crossed his arms tightly, shaking his head. He accused me of fabricating some elaborate corporate fantasy to save face. He told me to stop playing ridiculous games and start packing my boxes. I nodded silently to Julian. Julian did not raise his voice. He spoke with the terrifying precision of the ruthless corporate attorney he used to be. Bradley, Julian said smoothly, reading directly from the top document. Your commercial real estate portfolio is currently operating on a massive, unsustainable deficit. You have spent the last 3 years wildly over-leveraging your family assets to purchase high-profile buildings like this exact one. 2 weeks ago, your primary lenders began rejecting your refinancing applications. You were exactly 4 days away from a catastrophic chain of foreclosures that would have wiped out your entire generational wealth and left you completely bankrupt. Bradley stopped laughing instantly. His face drained of color, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. To stop the financial bleeding, Julian continued relentlessly. You took out a desperate, high-interest $15 million bridge loan from a private lender called Vanguard Credit. You signed the final paperwork yesterday afternoon. That loan is the only thing keeping your development firm out of federal bankruptcy court today. Bradley swallowed hard. His hands dropped heavily to his sides, the arrogant posture completely collapsing. How did you get access to my private financial records? He demanded, his voice suddenly thin. I will sue you for corporate espionage. I will have you thrown in federal prison. I leaned forward, resting my fingertips lightly on the glass desk. I did not steal your data, Bradley. I own it. Vanguard Credit is a subsidiary of Apex Lifestyle Holdings, I said softly, delivering the absolute kill shot. And as I explained to my husband this morning, Apex Lifestyle Holdings is my company. I am the sole founder and primary shareholder. I am the one who authorized your $15 million lifeline yesterday. I am your primary creditor. I own your debt, Bradley, which means I legally own you. The silence in the boutique was deafening. Bradley physically shook. He reached out blindly, gripping the edge of the reception desk, just to keep his knees from buckling. The realization that a black woman he had mercilessly mocked for half a decade now held his entire family legacy in her palm broke his mind completely. Julian tapped a specific paragraph highlighted on the final contract. The bridge loan you signed contains a standard morality and compliance clause, Julian noted. It grants Vanguard Credit the absolute right to call in the debt immediately if the borrower engages in hostile actions against the parent company or its executive officers. I picked up the 3-day eviction notice Bradley had brought in and tore it precisely down the middle. I dropped the torn pieces onto the floor at his feet. You came into my space, disrespected my business, and attempted to evict me, I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. That constitutes a hostile action. You have exactly 24 hours to return to this office and deliver a formal groveling apology to me and my assistant. If you fail to appear, I will call in the debt before lunch tomorrow. I will personally watch the banks auction off every single building your grandfather left you. Bradley could not speak a single word. He looked down at the torn eviction notice on the rug, then back up at me, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward, turning to run out of the boutique. The cheerful bell above the door jingled mockingly behind him. I watched him flee down the sidewalk in a blind panic. The real war was about to begin. Tasha would never accept this humiliation quietly. She would lash out completely unaware that her anger was about to trigger an avalanche that would bury her entire family. I watched the glass door swing shut, the cheerful chime echoing in the sudden silence of the boutique. Julian picked up the torn eviction notice from the floor and dropped it into the wastebasket. Before I could even ask him to pull up the rest of Bradley's loan documents, my private cell phone began to vibrate violently against the glass reception desk. The caller ID flashed with a name I fully expected: Tasha. I tapped the screen, placing the call on speaker, and immediately hit the record button. I did not even get the chance to say hello before a high-pitched hysterical shriek erupted from the device. Tasha was screaming so loudly the audio distorted. "What the hell did you do to my husband?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with unchecked rage. Bradley just walked into our house shaking like a leaf, pouring himself a double scotch at noon, talking about you threatening his business. Who do you think you are, playing these fake corporate games with my family? I leaned back in my chair, exchanging a knowing glance with Julian. I remained completely silent, letting the dead air provoke her further. Tasha could not handle silence. It made her feel small, so she compensated by getting louder, her true insecurities spilling out for the recording. "You have always been jealous of me, Valerie," she yelled, her words tripping over themselves. Ever since Elliot dragged you into my mother's dining room 5 years ago wearing that cheap off-the-rack dress, you thought you could just infiltrate our family and act like you belong. I am a third-generation Spelman graduate. I sit on the board of the most exclusive charities in Atlanta. You are nothing but a glorified caterer who tricked my brother into giving you his last name. I tapped my manicured fingernails against the desk, letting her continue her unhinged rant. Bradley provides for this family. Tasha screamed, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was secretly bankrupt. He is a real estate mogul. You are a public school nobody who plays with ribbons. You think handing him a fake financial document makes you powerful. I am going to destroy you. I am calling the president of the Piedmont Driving Club right now. I am calling every single bride, every corporate sponsor, and every socialite in Buckhead. By tomorrow morning, your little party planning business will be completely blacklisted. You will not even be able to book a child's birthday party in this city. You messed with the wrong woman, Valerie. I will make you a pariah. I will have you begging on the street. I let her heave heavy, furious breaths over the speaker. Julian raised an eyebrow, his fingers flying across his tablet as he logged every single threat she just made. I leaned closer to the microphone, keeping my voice cold and terrifyingly calm. Are you finished, Tasha? I asked smoothly. Because unlike you, I do not operate on gossip, jealousy, and country club rumors. I operate on signed contracts and massive corporate debt. You can call every socialite in Atlanta. It will not change the fact that your arrogant husband owes my company $15 million. And since you just explicitly threatened to intentionally sabotage my business operations on a recorded line, I consider this a direct breach of the good faith clause in his loan agreement. The line went dead silent. I could practically hear the blood draining from her face. Tell Bradley the clock is ticking, I said, and tapped the red button, cutting the call dead. The silence in the boutique felt victorious. I looked over at Julian, dropping the pleasant facade entirely. Expedite the financial audit on Bradley's entire portfolio, I commanded. Dig into every shell company, every hidden asset, and every offshore account. I want to know exactly where he funneled that $15 million. Julian did not miss a beat. He tapped his screen and projected the encrypted data onto the large monitor we kept hidden behind a display of imported silk flowers. I am already inside his accounts, Valerie, he said, his eyes scanning the rapidly scrolling numbers. And you are going to want to see this. Bradley is not just failing at commercial real estate. He has been systematically moving large sums of money into a blind trust over the past 6 months. A trust completely disconnected from Tasha and their joint marital assets. Before I could analyze the damning wire transfers on the screen, my security application flashed a bright red alert on my phone. My estate manager was calling from the front gate of my sprawling Buckhead mansion. I answered immediately, sensing the escalation. The guard's voice was tense and highly professional. Ma'am, your husband has just arrived at the primary gate. His access card is disabled as you requested, but he is refusing to leave the perimeter. And he is not alone. He has a young woman with him, and he is demanding immediate entry, claiming he still has marital rights to the property. He is stating that the woman is pregnant and will be moving into the guest house today. Elliot was spiraling. Instead of retreating after his public humiliation at the coffee shop, his bruised, fragile ego drove him to do the unthinkable. Driven by Tasha's venom and his own financial panic, he was trying to force his way into my sanctuary. He actually believed he could use outdated marital laws and intimidation tactics to bully me out of my own estate. I looked at Julian and grabbed my designer coat from the coat rack. The financial traps were perfectly set, and now it was time to handle the physical invasion. Elliot thought he could flaunt his pregnant secretary in my face and demand half of an empire he never helped build. He was about to find out that a disabled gate key was the absolute least of his problems. I instructed the guard to keep the heavy iron gates locked and told Julian to initiate the next phase of our strategy. The real war had arrived at my front door. I instructed the security guard to open the heavy iron gates, but keep the perimeter lockdown protocols fully active. I wanted Elliot to walk right into the center of my web, completely blind to the steel threads wrapping around his ankles. Julian and I exited the decoy storefront, stepped into the back of my waiting SUV, and rode back to my Buckhead estate, in calculated silence. When the heavy mahogany front doors of my home swung open, the sheer audacity of the scene waiting in my grand foyer almost made me laugh. Elliot was standing in the center of the imported marble floor, looking incredibly smug, holding two designer overnight bags. Clinging tightly to his left arm was Sienna. She was no longer wearing the inappropriate red gown from the corporate gala. Instead, she wore a tight cashmere sweater dress, specifically chosen to accentuate a very slight, undeniable curve at her waist. She rested her hand protectively over her stomach, looking around at my crystal chandeliers and vaulted ceilings with the greedy wide eyes of a woman who believed she had just won the lottery. Elliot puffed out his chest as I walked in, clearly riding the adrenaline high of whatever venomous pep talk his sister Tasha had just given him. Tasha had undoubtedly spent the last hour feeding his delusions, convincing him that his position in Atlanta high society made him legally and morally untouchable. He believed his pedigree protected him from consequences. "I see you finally decided to come home," Elliot sneered, dropping the overnight bags onto the polished floor with a heavy thud. Tasha called me. She told me all about the little financial theater you tried to pull on Bradley this afternoon. You actually printed out fake loan documents to scare my brother-in-law. You are completely delusional, Valerie. You have spent so much time decorating venues for wealthy people that you actually believe you are one of them. But playtime is officially over. I am putting an end to this embarrassing behavior right now. I stopped a few feet away from them, folding my arms across my chest. I did not look at Sienna. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on the man I had married 5 years ago. "You brought your secretary to my home, Elliot," I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "This is my home," Elliot shot back, his voice echoing up the grand staircase. "And Sienna is not just my secretary anymore. She is carrying my child, my heir. She needs a stress-free environment for the pregnancy, so she is moving into the guest house immediately. I have already instructed the estate staff to begin moving her things." Sienna offered me a saccharine, pitying smile. "I am so sorry it had to happen this way, Valerie," she chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But Elliot and I love each other. We are building a real family. A family needs space to grow. You understand, do you not?" I looked at the girl. She was 24 years old, blinded by the illusion of Elliot's wealth, completely unaware that the man she was clinging to did not even own the suit on his back. He had promised her a kingdom that belonged entirely to me. I turned my attention back to Elliot. "You disabled my access to the bank accounts this morning." Elliot continued, taking a step forward to assert his physical dominance in the foyer. "You locked my black card. You think that gives you power over me. You think a few administrative tricks will stop me. Let me remind you how the law actually works in this state." He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He threw it aggressively onto the entryway console table, the paper sliding across the smooth surface. "Those are divorce papers, Valerie. I just retained the most ruthless family law attorney in Atlanta. You want to play hardball? Fine. We are married. Under the law, I am entitled to 50% of all marital assets. I want half of the equity in this estate. I want half of the vehicles. And I am taking 50% of your little event planning business just to liquidate it and pay for Sienna's maternity ward expenses. My lawyer is already filing an emergency injunction to freeze every single bank account tied to your name until the courts divide the cash. You are going to walk away from this marriage with absolutely nothing." I stared at the divorce papers resting on the console table. Elliot genuinely believed he held the ultimate trump card. He believed that his gender, his corporate title, and his expensive attorney gave him the right to waltz into my sanctuary, flaunt his infidelity, and strip me of the empire I had built from the ground up. He thought the legal system was his weapon to wield against me. He assumed I was a terrified wife who would surrender everything just to avoid a messy public scandal in the elite social circles his mother prized so highly. "You are demanding half of my business to fund your mistress?" I asked, letting the sheer absurdity of his statement hang in the quiet foyer. "I am demanding what is legally mine," Elliot barked, his face flushed with triumph. "You should have stayed in your place, Valerie. You should have been grateful I elevated you to my social circle. Now you can pack your bags and leave. Sienna and I have a nursery to design." Julian stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, his presence immediately shifting the temperature in the room. He did not say a word to Elliot. He simply looked at me, waiting for the command. Elliot noticed Julian, and his smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, the memory of his public humiliation at the gala flashing behind his eyes. But Elliot quickly masked it with a sneer, wrapping his arm protectively around Sienna. I looked at the two of them standing in my foyer. They were so incredibly confident in their victory. They had no idea they were standing on a trap door, and I was holding the lever. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not validate their disrespect with an emotional reaction. I simply turned my head slightly, catching Julian's eye. I looked dead into Elliot's eyes, allowing the mask of the compliant wife to shatter completely, revealing the apex predator underneath. Initiate protocol Omega, I commanded Julian smoothly. Let us burn them down. Julian tapped the screen of his tablet twice. The heavy mahogany doors of my foyer clicked audibly as the magnetic locks engaged, sealing the perimeter of the estate. I did not raise my voice, nor did I need to. I simply informed Elliot that he and his pregnant mistress had exactly 2 minutes to exit my property before the private security detail, which Julian had just summoned, escorted them out by physical force. Elliot scoffed, aggressively waving his freshly printed divorce papers in my face. But the sudden appearance of 4 armed stoic security guards entering from the east wing wiped the smug satisfaction right off his flushed features. He grabbed Sienna by the arm, hissing desperate threats about court orders and immediate asset freezes, and dragged her out the front door. The heavy wood slammed shut behind them, leaving the foyer perfectly silent. The very next morning, the retaliation from his family began, with predictable viciousness. Vivian and Tasha did not waste a single second. They marched directly into the exclusive dining room of the Piedmont Driving Club, the absolute epicenter of Atlanta high society, and launched a highly coordinated venomous smear campaign. By noon, my phone was ringing incessantly with automated cancellation notices from my decoy event planning business. Tasha had spent hours calling every prominent socialite bride-to-be and corporate sponsor in our extensive network. She spun a hysterical, completely fabricated tale about how I had suffered a severe mental break, how I was sleeping with my young male assistant, and how I had been systematically embezzling Elliot's hard-earned wealth to fund a secret illicit lifestyle. Vivian backed up every single lie, shedding dramatic crocodile tears over her expensive brunch, claiming she was just a heartbroken mother trying to protect her successful son from a manipulative gold-digging fraud. Elliot, utterly emboldened by his mother and sister laying the social groundwork, made his aggressive legal move. He hired Marcus Sterling, a man notorious for being the most ruthless predatory divorce attorney in Fulton County. Marcus specialized in crushing opposing spouses through relentless procedural warfare and financial strangulation. By 3 in the afternoon, a private courier handed Julian a thick stack of official court orders. Elliot and his pitbull attorney had successfully filed an emergency injunction. By leveraging Vivian's fabricated story of my alleged embezzlement and erratic behavior, they convinced a sympathetic judge that I was a massive flight risk who was actively hiding marital assets. The judge swiftly granted a temporary freeze on all the front-facing business accounts tied to Valerie Events and Floral Design, as well as the joint checking accounts Elliot foolishly thought comprised my entire net worth. Across town, inside the lavish glass-walled conference room of the Sterling law firm, Elliot, Tasha, and Vivian were popping actual vintage champagne. Julian had easily intercepted a gloating email from Elliot to his legal team, celebrating the sudden account freeze. They genuinely believed they had just severed my financial jugular. They thought my entire livelihood was completely locked down, rendering me utterly destitute, helpless, and unable to even retain a decent lawyer to fight back against their assault. Elliot felt so empowered that he sent me a mocking text message telling me to get comfortable eating cheap ramen noodles in the dark because he was having the power and water to the Buckhead estate shut off by the end of the day. He told me I was about to learn what happens to women who forget their proper place in his family. I sat at the head of my sleek glass conference table in my hidden downtown penthouse office, casually looking over the court injunction. I did not feel a shred of panic. I looked at the aggressive legal signatures on the freeze order and felt only a deep, profound pity for Elliot's supreme ignorance. For 5 years, my husband had mocked my intelligence at every single opportunity. He believed that because I grew up in a modest working-class neighborhood in South Atlanta, I lacked the complex financial literacy required to navigate his elite corporate world. He assumed my brain only processed color palettes, seating charts, and catering menus. He never once stopped to ask how I managed to scale a simple floral shop into a highly lucrative enterprise so quickly without asking him for a single business loan. He just assumed I got lucky and coasted on his prestigious last name. I tossed the completely meaningless court order directly into the paper shredder beside my desk. The machine whirred to life, chewing the intimidation tactic into tiny, irrelevant strips of confetti. I turned my attention back to Jen, who was already running a comprehensive deep dive background check on Elliot's aggressive new lawyer, Marcus Sterling. The front-facing accounts they just proudly froze held less than $10,000 total. It was petty cash, meant entirely for paying local vendors for decoy parties and buying inventory. The actual millions, the offshore holding accounts, the heavily encrypted dark money portfolios, and the massive real estate subsidiaries were all perfectly insulated behind impenetrable corporate veils that Elliot did not even know existed. But I was not going to just let them sit there and enjoy their false sense of victory today or any other day. I wanted to completely break the very lawyer Elliot thought would guarantee his total financial triumph over my life. I turned and asked Julian what he had managed to dig up on Marcus Sterling. Julian offered a cold, calculated smile, projecting a series of highly classified, redacted financial documents onto the large wall monitor behind my desk. It turned out, Elliot's ruthless divorce attorney had a massive, crippling secret of his own, hidden deep within his firm's accounting software. And it was a devastating secret I was going to use to turn Elliot's vicious legal attack dog into a highly obedient, completely silent puppy. The real game was just beginning right now. I looked at the projected documents on the screen, then turned to Julian. He was typing furiously on his encrypted laptop eyes, reflecting the harsh blue light of the dual monitors. The temporary restraining order Elliot secured was a minor nuisance, but I demanded absolute perfection in our response. Julian explained the bypass strategy without looking up. The Fulton County judge had only frozen the domestic retail accounts tied to my public event planning license. Elliot and his lawyer cast a small net, capturing less than $10,000 of petty cash. Julian tapped a key, executing a pre-planned maneuver. He severed the connection between my decoy storefront and the massive offshore holding structures of Apex Lifestyle Holdings. Within 30 seconds, our global liquidity routed through a secure trust in the Cayman Islands, rendering it entirely invisible and legally untouchable by any family court judge in Georgia. Elliot thought he cut off my oxygen, but he barely managed to pinch a plastic straw. I walked to the monitors, watching the decoy account balances flatline. With my capital shielded, I needed to neutralize Elliot's attack dog. I asked Julian what he found on Marcus. Marcus had a terrifying reputation in Atlanta. He was the kind of divorce attorney who took pleasure in destroying women, stripping their assets, leaving them with nothing but legal fees and ruined credit. Men like Elliot hired Marcus because they shared the same toxic, misogynistic belief that wealth belonged exclusively to them. But men like Marcus were also inherently greedy, and greed always left a digital footprint. Julian brought up a highly classified financial dossier on the main screen. He smiled, pointing to a series of offshore wire transfers. Julian explained that Marcus was indeed a brutal lawyer, but also a spectacular fraud. For 6 years, Marcus had systematically siphoned settlement money from his high-net-worth female clients. Whenever he secured a massive divorce payout for a vulnerable woman, he quietly funneled a percentage of the marital equity into a private escrow account under a fake corporate name. Julian tracked the stolen funds directly to a boutique bank in the Bahamas. What Marcus did not realize was that this specific Bahamian bank utilized my company's proprietary cybersecurity software to conduct their quarterly compliance audits. We had full administrative access to his hidden ledger. Marcus Sterling had stolen over $4 million from the very women he was hired to protect. I did not waste a single second. I picked up my secure phone and dialed the private cellular number listed in Marcus Sterling's file. He answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with arrogant southern charm. He assumed I was calling to beg for a settlement or plead for access to my frozen checking accounts. He chuckled, telling me to direct all communication through his receptionist because he did not take pity calls from hostile opposing parties. I kept my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. I told Marcus to shut his mouth and open his personal email. Julian hit send, delivering a single encrypted screenshot of the Bahamian ledger directly to the lawyer's phone. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The arrogant silence that followed was absolute music to my ears. I spoke clearly, ensuring he understood the gravity of his situation. I told Marcus I knew exactly how he had been defrauding his vulnerable clients for over half a decade. I recited the exact routing numbers, the dates of the largest wire transfers, and the total stolen balance down to the final cent. My legal team had already drafted a comprehensive whistleblower report containing every piece of evidence required to have him permanently disbarred and indicted on federal wire fraud charges. If I pressed a single button, he would spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Marcus stammered, his voice instantly, losing all its previous bravado. He tried to offer a confidential settlement, frantically promising to drop Elliot as a client immediately. I told him dropping Elliot was not an option. If he quit, Elliot would just hire another aggressive lawyer, forcing me to repeat this entire process. I needed Marcus to stay exactly where he was and do exactly what I commanded. I issued my ultimatum. Marcus would file a discreet clerical motion citing a jurisdictional error, quietly and immediately lifting the freeze on all my operational accounts. However, he would look Elliot in the eye and guarantee the asset freeze was ironclad and active. Marcus would let my husband believe he had successfully bankrupted me. He would string Elliot along, validating every single delusion, while secretly ensuring my financial empire remained completely unhindered. If Marcus failed to comply, or if Elliot discovered the truth before I was ready, federal authorities would receive the Bahamian ledger anonymously. Marcus did not argue. He did not negotiate. He swallowed hard, his breathing heavy with panic, and agreed to every single condition I laid out. He promised to file the clerical correction within the hour and swore Elliot would never know a thing. I hung up the phone and set it down on the glass desk. Julian closed his laptop, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. The counter move was flawless. Across town in his mother's living room, Elliot was pouring an expensive glass of scotch, celebrating his fictional victory with Vivian and Tasha. They genuinely believed they had stripped me of my dignity, my business, and my future. They thought I was sitting in the dark, crying over a frozen bank account, thoroughly defeated by their superior wealth. They were blind to the fact that their vicious legal attack had been neutralized without me leaving my office chair. Elliot was riding high on a masterfully crafted illusion, unaware he was walking into a social slaughterhouse. The highly anticipated spring charity gala was days away. I would use that glittering stage to execute a public humiliation so profound it would shatter his entire world. The evening of the spring charity gala arrived, draped in the humid warmth of an Atlanta April. The venue was breathtaking, a sprawling botanical atrium transformed into a gilded wonderland of cascading orchids and crystal centerpieces. This was the undisputed pinnacle of the city's Black elite social calendar. Everyone who held any genuine power, influence, or generational wealth in Fulton County was stepping out of a black car tonight. I arrived wearing an emerald green silk gown that hugged my frame flawlessly, my posture radiating the kind of absolute certainty that only comes from holding a loaded gun under a poker table. As I handed my invitation to the front desk concierge, I saw Vivian. She was standing near the grand entryway wearing a feathered silver dress that looked more like armor, orchestrating the seating arrangements with ruthless precision. She spotted me immediately. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across her heavily contoured face. She genuinely believed I was walking into this atrium with $0 in my bank account, completely at her mercy after Elliot froze my retail accounts. Vivian marched over, her voice pitched perfectly to ensure the surrounding socialites, corporate sponsors, and local politicians could hear every single syllable. She did not greet me. She snatched my seating card from the concierge and loudly announced she would personally escort me to my assigned table. I followed her without a word, letting my silence amplify her aggressive volume. We walked past the stunning VIP tables, past the gold-rimmed plates, and the towering floral arrangements. We kept walking until we reached the very back of the atrium. Vivian stopped in a dark, cramped corner directly next to the heavy swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. The table was small, covered in a cheap white cloth, and wobbled unevenly on the polished floor. The smell of industrial dish soap and hot frying oil hung thickly in the air. Waiters with heavy trays rushed past, barely missing the back of the single isolated chair. Vivian turned to me, her eyes gleaming with pure, unadulterated malice. She declared loudly that this was my proper place. She stated that since I wanted to play the role of a struggling, penniless party decorator, she thought it was only fitting I sit near the service staff where I truly belonged. She made sure to emphasize that my husband had permanently cut my financial lifeline, loudly whispering that I was probably wearing a rented gown I could no longer afford. She sneered that the VIP section was reserved for actual investors, philanthropists, and women who understood how to protect a family dynasty, not public schoolgirls from South Atlanta who tried to embezzle from their betters. She leaned in close, ensuring I smelled her expensive perfume masking the bitterness underneath, and warned me not to approach her son or speak to his new family tonight. I looked across the expansive atrium. At the absolute center of the room, positioned directly in front of the main stage, sat Elliot. He was wearing a custom tuxedo, holding a glass of scotch, laughing loudly with Bradley. Tasha sat next to Bradley, glaring at me with a smug, victorious grin. And right beside Elliot, occupying the seat that legally belonged to me, was Sienna. She was wearing an aggressively tight maternity dress, openly resting her hand on her stomach, leaning her head on Elliot's shoulder. They looked perfectly content. They were celebrating my public execution, utterly convinced I was trapped in that dark corner, destitute and humiliated. They believed their coordinated smear campaign had broken my spirit and stripped me of every resource I had ever built. I did not give Vivian the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not flinch, argue, or storm out of the venue in tears. I offered Vivian a polite, chilling smile, pulled out the wobbly chair, and gracefully sat down. I arranged my emerald silk so it did not touch the dirty floor. I caught the eye of a frantic waiter rushing out of the kitchen doors and calmly requested a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lime. Vivian let out a disgusted huff, clearly frustrated that I was not having a hysterical meltdown, and stomped back toward her VIP table to join her son. I sat quietly in the shadows. The clatter of plates and the shouting of the kitchen staff behind me served as the perfect white noise. I sipped, my eyes locked on Elliot's table. Bradley was pouring champagne for Sienna. Tasha was snapping photos for her social media, undoubtedly preparing to post a highly curated narrative about their perfect family unit. Elliot was leaning back in his chair, shaking hands with passing executives, soaking up the praise and the status he believed he had completely secured. He was a man who thought he had successfully beaten his wife into total submission. I slowly pulled back the sleeve of my gown and checked my diamond-encrusted watch. The second hand ticked forward with beautiful mechanical precision. Julian was not in the room with me. He was currently positioned in the venue's secure audio-visual booth, overseeing the final digital transfers and monitoring the high-level guests arriving at the front door. We had meticulously mapped out the timeline of this evening. I was not banished to the kitchen doors. I was sitting in the sniper's nest. I watched the golden doors of the main entrance swing open, ushering in the final wave of elite guests. I took another slow sip of my water, letting the cold liquid ground me. The music swelled, the lights dimmed slightly, and the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. The clock was striking the exact minute we had planned. I rested my hands on the table, feeling the absolute certainty of the financial slaughter I was about to unleash. Elliot raised his glass in a toast to Bradley, laughing without a single care in the world, completely blind to the executioner sitting quietly in the dark. The golden doors of the grand atrium swung open with a resounding thud. The jazz band softened their tempo. A hush fell over the glittering crowd of Atlanta high society. Charles Kensington had arrived. He was the billionaire chairman of the investment firm, where Elliot worked, a man who controlled more wealth in Georgia than the governor. He was a formidable figure with silver hair and a piercing gaze. At the VIP table, Elliot tripped over his feet standing up. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket, an eager smile stretching across his face. He nudged Sienna, gesturing for his pregnant secretary to stand up straight. Tasha and Bradley stopped their arrogant chatter, desperate to look like the elite power couple. Vivian smoothed her silver dress, positioning herself in the chairman's direct line of sight. They expected the billionaire to walk straight to their central table. Charles Kensington stepped onto the marble floor, flanked by two private security guards. He walked with absolute purpose, his eyes scanning the massive room until they locked onto the dark, cramped corner in the very back of the venue. Elliot stepped from his table, extending his hand, a greeting forming on his lips. Kensington walked right past him without slowing down. He did not offer Elliot a single ounce of recognition. Elliot's hand hovered in empty air, his eager smile collapsing into unadulterated confusion. Vivian let out a soft gasp, physically stepping aside as the chairman's security detail parted the crowd. The silence in the atrium became deafening. The clinking of silverware stopped. Hundreds of elite socialites and executives turned their heads in unison, watching the most powerful man in Atlanta march directly away from the stage, heading straight for the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. I remained perfectly still in my chair. I simply rested my hands on the cheap white tablecloth, my posture radiating the calm authority of a queen receiving an expected guest. Kensington stopped right in front of my wobbly, isolated table. The smell of hot frying oil lingering in the air suddenly felt utterly irrelevant. The billionaire chairman slowly bowed his head to me. It was a deep, respectful bow of total submission and profound gratitude. Valerie Kensington said, his deep voice echoing clearly across the silent ballroom. I apologize for interrupting your evening. I was informed by my security team that you would be in attendance tonight, and I could not let another hour pass without thanking you in person. A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding tables. Guests strained their necks, desperate to hear why a billionaire was bowing to a woman seated by the kitchen doors. I offered him a polite, measured smile. It is entirely fine, Charles. I am just enjoying a quiet moment. Kensington placed a hand over his heart. What your crisis management firm did for my family last week was a miracle. When my youngest son made that catastrophic mistake in Dubai, my legal team told me it was over. We were going to lose hundreds of millions and face a public scandal that would ruin us for generations. But your team at Apex Lifestyle Holdings stepped in. You tracked the dark money, erased the footprint entirely, and recovered every asset before the press caught a whisper of the disaster. The silence in the room transformed into a suffocating pressure. The words hung in the air, crashing down on the VIP table like a ton of bricks. You saved my son from federal prison, Valerie Kensington continued, his voice thick with genuine emotion. You operate with a level of brilliance, ruthlessness, and discretion that this city has never seen. I owe you a debt that money simply cannot repay. If you ever need anything, you have my personal private line. I gracefully picked up my glass of sparkling water. I am simply doing my job, Charles. Tell your son to stay away from offshore gambling applications, and we will not cross paths professionally again. Kensington chuckled, a sound of pure relief, and bowed his head one more time before turning back to face the stunned crowd. Vivian had followed the chairman, desperate to insert herself into whatever conversation he was having. She stood just a few feet away from my table, frozen in place. Her face was completely drained of blood. Her eyes darted wildly between the billionaire chairman and the daughter-in-law she banished to the kitchen doors. She had spent the day spreading vicious rumors about me to the very people who were now staring at me with terrified respect. She had called me a public school nobody who embezzled petty cash. Now the most powerful man in the state had just publicly announced that I was the unseen force protecting his billionaire dynasty from federal ruin. The champagne flute slipped from Vivian's trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a violent, explosive crack. The glass shattered into 100 sparkling pieces, the sound echoing sharply through the quiet atrium like a gunshot. The expensive champagne splashed across her silver designer heels, but she did not even flinch. She just stared at me, her entire reality breaking apart. At the center table, Elliot looked like he was going to vomit. His mouth hung open, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. The horrific realization was finally clicking into place in his arrogant mind. The offshore holding company I told him about on the phone was not a bluff. It was a global empire, and he was nothing but an expendable employee working for a man who answered to me. I did not look at Vivian trembling over her broken glass. I did not look at Elliot hyperventilating at his table. I simply set my water down and checked the diamond-encrusted watch on my wrist. The second hand hit the 12. My public validation was complete. Now it was time for the execution. Exactly as the second hand swept past the 12 on my watch dial, a sharp buzzing sound sliced through the heavy silence of the atrium. It was not a polite notification chime. It was the aggressive, continuous vibration of a priority emergency override. The sound was coming directly from the breast pocket of Elliot's custom tuxedo. Elliot jolted in his seat. He was still staring wide-eyed at Charles Kensington, his brain completely short-circuiting from the sheer impossibility of his billionaire boss treating me like royalty. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, pulling it out and staring at the caller ID. The screen flashed bright red in the dim lighting of the gala. It was Marcus Sterling, his arrogant divorce attorney, trying to reach him. But before Elliot could swipe to answer, a second call overpowered it. This one was from David, the chief financial officer of Elliot's wealth management division. Elliot hit the green accept button, pressing the phone to his ear with trembling fingers. He tried to offer a standard polished corporate greeting, but he never even got the first syllable out. David was screaming. His voice was pitched so high and filled with so much raw panic that the audio bled out from the phone receiver, echoing clearly across the dead-silent VIP table. Tasha, Bradley, and Sienna all froze, leaning in involuntarily to hear the frantic shouting spilling from the device. "They are inside the building, Elliot." David shrieked, the sound of breaking glass and heavy footsteps thundering in the background of the call. Federal agents and the SEC just breached the lobby doors. They bypassed security and locked down the entire executive floor. They are confiscating the hard drives, the physical ledgers, everything. Elliot stood up so fast his chair tipped over and crashed onto the marble floor. He gripped the phone with both hands, his face completely devoid of color. "What are you talking about?" David Elliot hissed frantically, looking around the ballroom to see who was listening. "What federal agents? Tell security to halt them until legal counsel arrives." "There is no halting them." Elliot, the CFO, sobbed, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "They have federal warrants. They came straight for your department. They are not asking general questions. They brought specific, heavily redacted dossiers. They already know about the offshore shadow accounts you set up last year. They know about the missing VIP client funds. They are pulling the exact wire transfer receipts, showing the money you funneled into Bradley's failing real estate developments." Bradley choked on his champagne. He dropped his glass onto the table, coughing violently, his eyes bulging out of his head. Tasha grabbed her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket, as the reality of the CFO's words registered in her greedy, status-obsessed mind. "Shut up, David. Shut your mouth right now on an unsecure line," Elliot barked, sweat pouring down his forehead, destroying his polished facade. "You do not know what you are saying. Call our compliance officers immediately." "The compliance officers are already in handcuffs, Elliot." David cried out, the sheer hopelessness in his voice broadcasting his total surrender. "The agents told me they received a completely impenetrable anonymous whistleblower data dump this morning. Someone fed them our entire internal network structure. They bypassed our firewalls like they had the master keys. The lead federal agent just told me they are dispatching a secondary tactical unit to your location right now to secure your passport. You need to run, Elliot. They are coming to arrest you." The call abruptly disconnected, leaving a hollow dial tone ringing out over the speaker. Elliot stood paralyzed in the center of the Atlanta high society he worshipped so deeply. The elite guests, the managing partners, and the corporate sponsors were all staring at him in absolute disgust. He had spent his entire life building an image of untouchable financial supremacy, looking down on working-class people and treating me like a disposable accessory. Now, in less than 60 seconds, he was publicly exposed as a desperate white-collar criminal. Sienna stood up from her chair, her hands clutching her pregnant belly. She looked at Elliot with wide, terrified eyes, realizing the wealthy future she sold her morals to secure was evaporating into federal prison sentences. She took a slow step backward, physically distancing herself from the man she had proudly clung to just an hour earlier. Elliot's breathing became shallow and erratic. He looked frantically around the room, his eyes darting from the disgusted faces of his colleagues to the furious glare of Charles Kensington. Then his gaze slowly tracked across the massive ballroom, moving past the crystal centerpieces and the towering floral arrangements, until it finally landed on the dark, cramped corner next to the kitchen doors. He finally looked directly at me. I remained comfortably seated in my chair, completely unbothered by the absolute destruction of his life. I did not look away. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. I reached out, wrapping my fingers around the stem of my sparkling water glass. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, I lifted the glass into the air, raising it in a silent, mocking toast directed entirely at him. The realization hit Elliot with the brutal force of a physical blow. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. He looked at the raised glass, then at Charles Kensington, then back at me. He remembered the financial documents I had effortlessly weaponized against Bradley that morning. He remembered the locked black card. He remembered Julian adjusting my necklace with the calm precision of a man who held all the tactical advantages. I was not a struggling party planner. I was the master key. I was the architect of his total downfall. I was the anonymous whistleblower who just handed his entire fraudulent existence over to the federal government. The true depth of his fatal miscalculation finally sank in completely. The morning sun offered no warmth through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom. Less than 12 hours had passed since the federal raid shattered the spring charity gala, leaving the wealth management firm in absolute chaos. Yellow federal tape zigzagged across the frosted glass of Elliot's department. Agents had already hauled away dozens of cardboard boxes filled with physical ledgers and encrypted hard drives. Inside the soundproof boardroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, doing nothing to cool the sweat pouring down Elliot's face. He sat near the center of the massive mahogany table, his custom tuxedo replaced by a rumpled charcoal suit. He was flanked by two nervous corporate defense attorneys retained at 3 in the morning. At the head of the table stood Charles Kensington, the billionaire chairman who had bowed to me just hours prior. Today, his piercing eyes held the cold, calculating fury of a man whose financial empire had just been violated. The remaining board members sat frozen in their high-backed leather chairs, waiting for the execution to begin. Kensington slammed a redacted federal warrant onto the mahogany table. The sharp crack made Elliot physically flinch. The chairman did not yell. His voice was dangerously low, carrying a lethal authority that demanded absolute submission. He demanded to know exactly how millions of dollars in highly secure client funds had vanished from the firm's holding accounts. He wanted to know why federal agents were currently tearing through his legacy institution looking for offshore routing numbers tied directly to Elliot's personal executive credentials. Elliot swallowed hard. His hands shook as he reached for a glass of water, spilling drops onto the polished wood. He looked around the room, desperate to find a single sympathetic face among the board members. He found none. The men who had toasted his success yesterday were now looking at him like a diseased animal, driven by pure panic and toxic entitlement. Elliot decided to execute the only strategy he had left. He decided to play the ultimate victim. He stood up, placing his shaking hands flat on the table, and began spinning a web of absolute pathological lies. He swore on his life that he had never touched a single cent of the missing client funds. He looked directly at Kensington and pointed his finger squarely at me. He told the board that his wife Valerie was the true architect of the embezzlement. He frantically spun a narrative painting himself as a dedicated, hard-working executive manipulated by a vindictive, calculating woman. He leaned heavily into the ingrained corporate biases of the room, hoping his elite status and gender would grant him the benefit of the doubt. He claimed my event planning business was a highly sophisticated shell company, a fraudulent front designed specifically to launder stolen money. He raised his voice, shifting from panic to manufactured outrage. He told the board I had used my position as his wife to secretly access his secure digital devices while he slept. He claimed I bypassed his biometric locks, transferred the funds into my own offshore accounts, and deliberately tipped off the Securities and Exchange Commission to frame him. He painted a picture of a gold-digging sociopathic woman trying to destroy a good man because our marriage was ending. I even dragged Sienna into his lie, claiming his young secretary had stumbled upon my financial crimes and that I orchestrated the entire federal raid to silence her and ruin his reputation before the divorce could begin. He begged the board to give his legal team 48 hours to subpoena my business records, promising evidence to clear his name and save the firm from a public scandal. Elliot was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with his trembling hand. He looked around the boardroom, desperately trying to read the expressions of the senior partners. He thought he was delivering the performance of a lifetime. He genuinely believed he could leverage his position in Atlanta high society to shift the blame onto a woman he had spent 5 years belittling. He thought the board would align with one of their own, choosing to sacrifice a party planner to protect the firm's prestigious image. He took a deep breath, regaining a tiny fraction of his arrogant posture as he prepared to deliver his final plea for corporate solidarity. He opened his mouth to demand that the firm direct their elite legal resources against me. But the words died in his throat. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the boardroom clicked open with a sharp thud. The sound cut through Elliot's pathetic monologue like a guillotine. The two armed security guards stationed at the entrance stepped aside immediately. Every single head in the room turned toward the doorway. Elliot's breathing stopped completely. His eyes widened in sheer horror as the color vanished entirely from his face. He watched in absolute paralysis as the deceitful narrative he had spent 20 minutes building disintegrated into dust. I stepped into the room. I was not wearing the emerald gown from the night before, nor the pastel outfits I wore to my decoy storefront. I wore a razor-sharp tailored white crepe suit that radiated chilling authority. I carried no purse, only a single sleek black leather portfolio. Julian walked half a step behind me, holding a stack of encrypted tablets. I did not look at Elliot. I did not acknowledge his frantic, hyperventilating presence near the center of the table. I walked directly past his trembling lawyers, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Kensington stood up immediately, gesturing toward the empty, high-backed leather chair positioned directly across from him, at the absolute head of the table. It was the seat reserved exclusively for the board's special risk and compliance advisor. I pulled the chair out, gracefully took my seat, and placed the leather portfolio squarely on the mahogany wood. The execution was about to begin. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Every senior partner, every corporate defense attorney, and the billionaire chairman himself stared at the black leather portfolio I had just placed on the polished mahogany. Elliot looked like he was going to pass out. He grabbed the edge of the large table, his knuckles turning a stark, translucent white, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He looked wildly at his lawyers, silently begging them to object to my sudden presence, but they were seasoned professionals. They took one look at the deference radiating from Charles Kensington and knew immediately that I held all the cards. I unclasped the portfolio. Julian stood perfectly still over my right shoulder, his posture rigid and highly alert, functioning as both my legal counsel and my absolute enforcer. He reached forward and tapped the biometric lock on the thick black book nestled inside my portfolio. The small light flashed green and the heavy leather cover popped open. I did not look at Elliot. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on the powerful men who ran this prestigious financial empire. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the expansive room. "I know most of you have only seen me at holiday galas or charity dinners standing quietly beside my husband and playing the role of the compliant spouse. You have been led to believe I am a simple party planner, a woman obsessed with floral arrangements and seating charts. I am sure Elliot has spent the last half hour telling you a very compelling, highly dramatic story about a vindictive wife trying to ruin a good man during a messy divorce. Elliot slammed his hand down on the table, desperation breaking through his paralysis. Charles, you cannot let her do this, he pleaded, his voice cracking with raw panic. She has no security clearance to be in this room. She is the one who tipped off the federal agents. She orchestrated the entire raid. You have to have security remove her before she compromises the firm any further. She is actively trying to destroy us. Charles Kensington did not even blink. He slowly turned his head to look at Elliot, his expression devoid of a single ounce of pity or corporate solidarity. Sit down and shut your mouth, Elliot, Kensington commanded, his tone, dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. You are currently speaking to the firm's special risk and compliance advisor. She possesses a security clearance significantly higher than your own. In fact, she is the only reason the Federal Bureau of Investigation is not currently hauling me out of this building in handcuffs alongside you. You will sit in that chair, you will keep your mouth shut, and you will listen to what the woman who owns your entire existence has to say. Elliot fell back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. The air rushed out of his lungs. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horrific, dawning realization. The foundation of his entire arrogant reality was crumbling into dust right in front of him. Thank you, Charles, I said smoothly. I turned the black book toward the center of the table so the board could see the densely packed pages. As your chairman just clarified, Valerie Events and Floral Design is a meticulously constructed decoy. It is a shell corporation designed to mask my actual operations. My true company is Apex Lifestyle Holdings. We do not plan parties. We are a highly specialized private equity and lifestyle concierge firm. We manage the deeply sensitive, highly classified vulnerabilities of Atlanta's top 1%. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the terrified faces of the board members. When your wealthy clients make catastrophic mistakes, I continued, my voice steady and lethal. When a politician needs to quietly resolve an extortion threat, when a real estate mogul needs $15 million of bridge financing to avoid a highly public federal bankruptcy, or when a prominent CEO needs to route dark money through offshore accounts without triggering a single government alarm, they do not call wealth managers like Elliot. They call me. I hold the restrictive non-disclosure agreements. I manage the shadow ledgers. I know exactly where every single dirty dollar in this city is buried, because I am the one who holds the shovel. One of Elliot's defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, loosening his expensive silk tie. He leaned forward, attempting to salvage his client's rapidly disintegrating defense. With all due respect, ma'am. The lawyer started, his voice laced with cautious hesitation. If you are handling illicit funds, then my client's assertion might still hold legal weight. He claims you accessed his devices and framed him to cover your own financial crimes. How do we know you did not orchestrate this massive federal raid to bury your own tracks and simply use his accounts as a convenient scapegoat? Julian did not let me answer. He stepped forward, slamming a dense, freshly printed document directly onto the lawyer's legal pad. The sound made the attorney jump. Because my client does not operate outside the bounds of federal law, Julian stated, his voice ringing with the aggressive authority of a seasoned prosecutor. Apex Lifestyle Holdings is a federally registered, fully compliant security firm. We have an active, ongoing partnership with the Securities and Exchange Commission to audit high-risk banking institutions. My client did not frame your client. Your client was careless, greedy, and stupid enough to use his own unsecured corporate credentials to steal money from the very people my client was hired to protect. Elliot shook his head frantically, his breathing shallow and rapid. No, that is a lie, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. You are sleeping with her. You are helping her steal my money. You fabricated those audits to ruin my life because she wants my assets. I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. I flipped open the black book to the very first tab. The heavy premium paper was covered in highly detailed spreadsheets, bank routing numbers, and encrypted communication logs. I did not need Julian to defend my honor. I was about to dissect Elliot's entire fraudulent operation with surgical precision, piece by piece, dollar by dirty dollar. Let us stop wasting time with your pathetic, desperate lies. Elliot, I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the mahogany table. You want to talk about stolen money? You want to talk about who is really laundering funds in this city? Let us open the ledger. Let us talk about exactly what you did with Charles Kensington's missing VIP client accounts. The entire boardroom leaned in, completely captivated by the black book. Elliot shrank back into his chair, trying to make himself as small as possible, realizing there was absolutely no escape. The doors were locked, his lawyers were useless, and his boss was ready to serve him to the federal agents waiting in the lobby. I had stripped him of his title, his resources, and his fake superiority. Now I was going to strip him of his freedom. I looked down at the first page of the black book. I tapped the base of the thick leather binder, and the massive flat screens on the boardroom walls flickered to life. The projection displayed a highly complex web of offshore banking routes, highlighted in bright red ink. I pointed to the very top of the hierarchy where Charles Kensington's most secure private wealth accounts were listed. 3 months ago, I began, my voice carrying cleanly across the silent room. Elliot realized that his brother-in-law Bradley was facing total financial ruin. Bradley had severely over-leveraged his commercial real estate portfolio. As a proud old money white developer, Bradley refused to admit to his wealthy black in-laws that he was bankrupt. He maintained his arrogant superiority at every family dinner, continuing to patronize me while secretly begging Elliot for a financial bailout behind closed doors. Elliot, desperate to maintain Bradley's respect and secure his own fragile ego within the family dynamic, decided to play the ultimate savior. I swiped my hand across my digital tablet, and the screen shifted. It showed a series of massive wire transfers moving from Kensington's VIP client funds into a dummy corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. But Elliot did not have the personal capital to save Bradley. I continued maintaining eye contact with the board members. So he stole it. He used his senior executive clearance to bypass the internal security protocols. He siphoned a total of $22 million from the firm's most protected portfolios. He broke the funds down into smaller randomized deposits to avoid triggering the automated fraud alerts. Elliot squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head, pressing his palms against his ears as if trying to block out the sound of his own destruction. His defense attorneys stared at the screens in sheer horror, completely abandoning their legal pads. They recognized irrefutable evidence when they saw it. I swiped the screen again. The projection zoomed in on the dummy corporation, tracing the money back to American soil. From the Cayman Islands, the stolen client funds were funneled directly into 3 failing construction projects owned by Bradley's real estate firm. Elliot and Bradley created fake invoices for architectural consulting and material procurement to justify the sudden influx of cash. Bradley used your client's money to pay off his desperate creditors and keep his country club memberships active. They thought they were financial geniuses. They thought their racial and corporate privileges made them invisible to the law, but they were sloppy. Bradley left a massive digital footprint, and Elliot used his primary corporate email to authorize the final transfers. Charles Kensington slammed his fist onto the mahogany table. The violent sound echoed like a gunshot. He glared at Elliot with a hatred so pure it seemed to lower the room's temperature. You stole from my family to bail out your worthless brother-in-law. Kensington roared, his silver hair trembling with rage. You compromised this entire institution for a failing strip mall developer. Elliot opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Charles, please, it was just a temporary loan. Bradley swore he was going to flip the properties and pay the accounts back with interest before the quarterly audits. I was protecting my sister's marriage. I was going to replace every single cent. I did not let him finish his cowardly explanation. I tapped my tablet for the 3rd time. The screen shifted away from Bradley's real estate firm and illuminated a completely different set of financial records. If it was just a temporary loan to save your sister's marriage, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, then you will have to explain to the board what you did with the remaining $4 million. Because Bradley did not receive the entire $22 million, the board members leaned closer to the screens. The new documents displayed property deeds, luxury vehicle registrations, and exorbitant credit card statements. You siphoned $4 million into a separate shadow account, I explained, looking directly at Elliot's terrified face. And you used that stolen client money to purchase a luxury penthouse condo in Midtown Atlanta. A condo that is currently registered under the name Sienna Miller. The entire room inhaled sharply. The revelation dropped like a live grenade onto the polished wood table. You did not just risk federal prison to save your brother-in-law, I continued relentlessly. You stole millions of dollars from this prestigious firm to buy real estate imported sports cars and diamond jewelry for your 24-year-old secretary. You funded your pathetic cliché midlife crisis with the chairman's money. You even paid for her exclusive maternity care using the firm's hidden corporate expense accounts. I looked at Elliot's defense attorneys. I asked them if they wanted me to project the security footage from the Midtown condo lobby, or if the wire transfer receipts bearing Elliot's digital signature were sufficient for their records. The lead attorney slowly closed his briefcase. He did not say a word. He simply looked at Elliot and shook his head, signaling his absolute surrender. The legal team knew they were looking at decades in federal prison. There was no defense strategy that could overcome this level of documented forensic proof. Elliot was completely broken. His shoulders collapsed and he slumped forward in his chair, burying his face in his hands. He began to sob loudly, the sound echoing pathetically in the silent boardroom. The man who had walked into my home yesterday, demanding half of my business and threatening to leave me destitute, was now crying like a helpless child. He had spent 5 years treating me like an uneducated peasant. Now I was sitting at the head of his boardroom, holding the exact financial autopsy that proved he was nothing more than a greedy, incompetent thief. But Elliot was a narcissist to his very core. He could not accept total defeat without trying to inflict one last desperate wound. He wiped his tear-stained face and looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a frantic, unhinged malice. He knew his career was over. He knew he was going to prison. But his toxic entitlement demanded that he drag me down with him. He braced his shaking hands on the table and prepared to launch his final desperate attack, genuinely believing he still held one ultimate legal weapon against me. Elliot pushed himself up from the heavy leather chair, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. A low, breathless sound escaped his throat. It started as a frantic wheeze but quickly warped into a sharp, unhinged laugh that echoed against the glass walls of the boardroom. The senior partners exchanged highly disturbed glances. Charles Kensington narrowed his eyes in absolute disgust, watching a man he once trusted unravel into total sociopathy. Elliot did not look at his boss anymore. He fixed his bloodshot, manic eyes entirely on me. He wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand and stood up straight. "Fine," Elliot shouted, his voice cracking with a toxic mixture of panic and sudden blinding greed. "Fine. I took the money. I moved the funds to Bradley. I bought the penthouse for Sienna. Who cares? It does not matter anymore. None of this matters." He stepped away from his chair, pacing aggressively. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the digital projections, illuminating the boardroom walls, gesturing wildly at the massive financial networks of Apex Lifestyle Holdings. "Look at those numbers!" Elliot yelled, his voice bouncing off the acoustic panels. "Look at the capital moving through those offshore accounts. My wife just sat in this room and openly admitted to managing hundreds of millions of dollars in highly lucrative corporate crisis contracts. She just confessed to owning a massive global private equity firm. And she built that entire empire while she was married to me." He stopped pacing and slammed both hands onto the mahogany table, leaning forward with a cruel, triumphant sneer spreading across his wet face. He looked at Charles Kensington, abandoning any pretense of professional remorse. "You want your $22 million back?" Charles Elliot demanded, his tone dripping with sudden delusional arrogance. "Give me 24 hours. I will wire you $30 million to cover the inconvenience. You can call off your federal attack dogs. I do not need this firm anymore. I do not need my executive salary. I just hit the ultimate jackpot, and my stupid, arrogant wife handed it to me on a silver platter." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the black leather portfolio. I let him expose the rotting core of his character to the most powerful men in Atlanta. "We live in a state that recognizes marital property," Valerie Elliott sneered, taking a slow, predatory step toward my end of the table. "We have been married for 5 years. You founded Apex Lifestyle Holdings 3 years ago. I do not care how many shell companies you created or how many offshore trusts you used to hide the revenue. Under the law, every single asset generated during this marriage is subject to equitable division. And since I am currently facing massive financial liabilities, any judge in Fulton County will grant me an emergency liquidation of your assets to cover my legal restitution. I am legally entitled to half of your entire empire. One of his corporate defense attorneys finally spoke up quietly, urging Elliot to sit down and stop making admissions on the record, but Elliot brutally waved the lawyer away. He was completely drunk on the fantasy of his sudden salvation. "Do you hear me?" Valerie Elliot shouted, slamming his fist onto the table right in front of Julian. "I am taking 50% of everything you own. I am going to call Marcus Sterling right now. He will file a massive discovery motion before lunch. He will freeze your offshore accounts, your Cayman Island trusts, and your global liquidity. You thought you were so incredibly brilliant playing the secret mastermind while I paid the mortgage. But you are just a foolish, uneducated woman from South Atlanta who forgot how marriage laws work. You spent 5 years working in the shadows, grinding yourself to the bone, manipulating billionaires, and all you actually did was build a massive bulletproof safety net for me." Elliot let out another sharp, manic laugh. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of his own perceived genius. He had just been caught stealing millions from his employer, funding an affair with a 24-year-old secretary, and orchestrating a massive real estate fraud with his arrogant white brother-in-law. Yet in his mind, he was still the ultimate victor. He believed his gender, and his marital certificate granted him supreme authority over my labor, my intelligence, and my wealth. "I am going to strip you down to the absolute studs," Elliot promised, his voice dropping to a vicious, cruel register as he stared down at me. "I am going to take my 50%. I am going to pay off the Securities and Exchange Commission fines. And then I am going to buy a much bigger, much more expensive penthouse for Sienna and my child. I am going to liquidate your entire life to fund my fresh start. And when Marcus Sterling is finished draining your accounts with endless litigation fees, you will not even have enough money left to buy a bus ticket back to the public school neighborhood you crawled out of." He turned to Julian, who was standing beside my chair with a posture carved from solid ice. "You can pack up your little black book, assistant," Elliot mocked, pointing a dismissive finger at Julian. "In fact, you work for me now. I own half of your employment contract. Leave the files on the table and get out of my boardroom before I have you arrested for corporate trespassing." The boardroom remained completely silent. The senior partners stared at Elliot with expressions of pure revulsion. Even in high finance, they had never witnessed a man so devoid of basic human dignity. Charles Kensington shook his head slowly in profound disgust, realizing the true nature of the monster he had employed. I did not interrupt his manic victory speech. I let his threats hang in the cold, heavily air-conditioned air. I wanted him to feel the absolute peak of his false triumph. I wanted him to taste the billions he thought he had just secured. I wanted his ego to inflate to its absolute maximum capacity before I dropped the anvil. I slowly turned my head and looked up at Julian. Julian understood the exact timing of the execution. He reached inside his tailored jacket pocket. The final fatal blow was ready to be delivered. Julian withdrew his hand from his tailored jacket pocket. He did not pull out a weapon, though the document he held was infinitely more lethal. He stepped forward with a cold, meticulously practiced smile. The room watched in stunned silence as he tossed a thick cream-colored legal manuscript directly onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy thud, sliding just inches away from Elliot's trembling fingers. The gold-embossed seal of a prominent Atlanta law firm glimmered under the harsh boardroom lights. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my husband. I asked him if he recognized the document. I asked him to cast his mind back exactly 5 years ago to the second week of our marriage. We were sitting in his mother's opulent living room. Vivian had poured herself a glass of expensive bourbon, looked me up and down, like I was something she had scraped off her designer shoe, and shoved a pen into my hand. She had demanded I sign a post-nuptial agreement. She and Elliot were utterly convinced I was just a financially illiterate public school girl looking for a quick payout. They wanted to aggressively protect Elliot's highly anticipated partnership track and his precious generational wealth from my supposedly greedy lower-class grasp. Elliot stared at the document on the table, his chest heaving. He stammered that the post-nuptial agreement guaranteed him absolute protection. He claimed it explicitly stated that what was his remained his, and what was mine remained mine, but any business created during the marriage was subject to equitable division unless explicitly exempted. He puffed out his chest, desperately clinging to his fading legal illusion. He shouted that his lawyers had drafted it specifically to ensure I could never touch his assets, which inherently meant he could still legally dissect mine if I built an empire under his roof. I let out a soft, genuinely amused laugh that echoed sharply in the silent boardroom. I told Elliot that he was absolutely right about the original draft his mother had commissioned. It was a brutal, one-sided contract designed to leave me destitute if we ever divorced. But I reminded him of a critical detail he had arrogantly ignored. I reminded him that I had asked to take the document home to review it for 24 hours before signing it in front of the notary. He had mocked me, laughing that I would not understand the complex legal jargon anyway, but he allowed it. That was his fatal mistake. I did not just read the document, I completely rewrote it. I nodded to Julian. Julian leaned over the table, his posture radiating pure legal menace. He instructed Elliot's defense attorneys to turn to page 47, subsection C, paragraph 4. The two frantic lawyers immediately grabbed the thick manuscript, their fingers scrambling to find the exact page. As their eyes scanned the densely packed legal text, the blood rapidly drained from their faces. The lead attorney dropped the document as if it were on fire, his mouth hanging open in complete, professional horror. He slowly turned his head to look at Elliot, shaking his head in absolute defeat. Elliot demanded to know what it said, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate shriek. He grabbed the document himself, his hands shaking so violently he tore the page. I did not wait for his lawyer to explain it. I recited the clause from memory, every single word burned into my brain for the past 5 years. I told Elliot that I had quietly inserted a specialized morality and compliance clause into the final draft before we had it notarized. The clause explicitly stated that in the event of proven infidelity, validated by medical records, or indisputable digital evidence, or in the event that either party faced federal felony charges involving financial fraud, the offending party would immediately and irreversibly forfeit 100% of all marital assets. Furthermore, the offending party would be legally bound to pay total and complete restitution for any damages inflicted upon the innocent spouse's business entities. Elliot stared at the paper, his eyes darting frantically across the text. He choked on his own breath. He looked up at me, his face twisted in a mask of pure terror. He tried to argue that the clause was unenforceable, that no judge in Fulton County would uphold a secretly modified post-nuptial agreement. Julian shut him down instantly. Julian stated that the document was fully authenticated, signed by Elliot in the presence of 2 legal witnesses, and officially filed with the state. Elliot had simply been too arrogant and too lazy to read the final version before picking up his pen. He assumed a woman from South Atlanta could never outsmart a senior wealth manager. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands. I looked directly into Elliot's panicked, bloodshot eyes. I told him he had triggered not just one, but both conditions of the extreme forfeiture clause. He was currently under active federal investigation for stealing $22 million in a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. That covered the felony fraud provision perfectly. Elliot frantically shook his head. He screamed that he had not been convicted yet, that an active investigation was not a guilty verdict, and that I could not trigger the asset forfeiture on a pending federal charge. He grasped blindly at any legal straw to save his delusion of claiming half my multi-million-dollar empire. I smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sealed his absolute doom. I told him he was right about the federal charges pending trial. However, the infidelity clause was entirely separate, immediate, and fully actionable today. Elliot barked a desperate, hysterical laugh. He pointed out that I had no medical proof of his affair with Sienna. He claimed I was just an angry, jealous wife making baseless accusations to steal his money, conveniently forgetting that he was the one actively trying to steal mine. He screamed that dragging his secretary to a gala was not a legal admission of adultery, and that I had absolutely zero hard medical evidence to trigger the postnuptial forfeiture. I sat back in my chair, allowing his final burst of arrogant defiance to ring out across the boardroom. He really thought he had found a loophole. He actually believed his cheating was a flawless secret. I looked at Julian and nodded once. The financial trap had successfully snapped shut around Elliot's neck, severing his access to every single dime I owned. Now it was time to drop the final devastating piece of evidence onto the table, the very evidence that would not only activate the contract, but completely destroy his family from the inside out. I kept my hand resting on the smooth leather of the portfolio, letting the deafening silence of the boardroom stretch out for another painful second. The trap had closed, but the execution was not quite finished. From the back of the executive suite, a sudden commotion shattered the quiet. Tasha, who had bullied her way past the lobby security guards that morning to protect her real estate interests, could no longer contain her toxic rage. She stomped forward, her designer heels hitting the hardwood floor like hammer strikes. She completely ignored the billionaire chairman and the corporate attorneys. She marched right up to the edge of the mahogany table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you have won!" Tasha screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the acoustic ceiling panels. "You think you can just march in here and steal everything my brother worked for? You are nothing, Valerie. You are a bitter, empty woman who could never give Elliot what he truly needed. You can take the bank accounts, but you cannot take his legacy. Sienna is carrying the family heir. She is pregnant with Elliot's child. That baby secures his future, and no judge in Atlanta is going to let you leave a pregnant woman and a newborn child out on the street." Sienna, who had been cowering in the corner chair next to Bradley, suddenly sat up straighter. She wrapped both arms protectively around her slight baby bump, trying to look like a fragile victim. Elliot managed to lift his head, a pathetic glimmer of hope flashing in his bloodshot eyes. He actually believed his sister's hysterical outburst might somehow trigger a sympathy clause from the board of directors to combat the ironclad post-nuptial agreement. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Tasha with a profound, chilling sense of pity. "You are so obsessed with your perfect family image, Tasha," I said smoothly. "You have spent your entire life looking down on other women while blindly trusting the men in your own house. You claim Sienna is carrying the future of your prestigious family. I suppose it is finally time we clarify exactly whose future she is carrying." I nodded to Julian. He unzipped the inner pocket of my portfolio and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He walked around the massive table and slid the envelope directly across the polished wood, stopping it right in front of Tasha. Bradley suddenly shifted his weight. The arrogant real estate developer who had threatened to evict me just 24 hours ago suddenly looked like he was going to vomit. His face drained of all color. He took a hesitant step backward, his eyes darting wildly between the envelope and the boardroom exit. Sienna let out a terrified gasp and tried to stand up, but Julian effortlessly shifted his stance, physically blocking the only door out of the suite. "Open it, Tasha," I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. "Open the envelope and meet the newest addition to your elite family." Tasha glared at me, her chest heaving with indignant rage. She snatched the envelope off the table and ripped the paper seal. She reached inside and pulled out a stack of high-resolution glossy photographs, along with a certified medical document from a private maternal health clinic in Buckhead. I watched Tasha's eyes scan the clinical text. I watched her read the estimated date of conception. Then I watched her pull out the photographs. They were high-definition security camera stills, taken from the private parking garage and the VIP elevators of the Four Seasons Hotel in Midtown. The timestamps on the photos aligned perfectly with the medical conception dates. The images were impossible to deny. They clearly showed Sienna dressed in a tight black dress, passionately kissing a man in the hotel elevator. But the man pulling her into his arms was not Elliot. The man pressing Sienna against the elevator wall, the man walking her into the luxury hotel suite, was Bradley. Tasha stopped breathing. The expensive medical documents slipped from her trembling fingers, fluttering silently onto the boardroom table. She stared at the photographs, her brain desperately trying to reject the horrific reality unfolding right in front of her eyes. I leaned forward, making sure every single man in the boardroom heard my next words. "Sienna is not carrying Elliot's baby," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating air. "She never was. Elliot was just the wealthy, convenient idiot she used to pay for her luxury condo and her designer maternity clothes. Sienna is carrying Bradley's baby. Your husband has been sleeping with your brother's secretary for the last 8 months. He has been using the same luxury hotel suite every single Tuesday afternoon, paying for the room with the exact same corporate credit card Elliot gave him to fund his failing real estate projects. The entire boardroom exploded into sheer unadulterated chaos. Elliot leaped out of his chair, letting out a guttural sound of pure disbelief. He spun around, staring at Sienna, who was now sobbing hysterically and backing away from him. He then looked at his brother-in-law, the man he had just risked $22 million and 20 years in federal prison to save. Elliot realized he had destroyed his career, his marriage, and his freedom to finance a woman who was actively sleeping with his own sister's husband. The humiliation broke his mind completely. He collapsed back into his chair, clutching his chest as he hyperventilated. But Tasha did not collapse. The pristine image-obsessed socialite snapped completely. She let out a blood-curdling, agonizing scream that tore through the executive suite. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire fabricated universe burn to ash. She dropped the photographs and lunged across the boardroom. She completely ignored the billionaire chairman, the federal evidence on the screens, and the team of corporate defense attorneys. She threw herself directly at Bradley. Her manicured nails transformed into claws as she viciously attacked her husband. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive custom suit, ripping the fabric as she struck his chest, his face, and his shoulders. She screamed obscenities, cursing him for humiliating her, for destroying her status, and for bringing his pregnant mistress into her family. Bradley stumbled backward, crashing into a row of leather chairs. He threw his arms up desperately, trying to block his wife's frantic blows, crying and stammering pathetic excuses about how it was just a physical mistake. Sienna shrieked in terror, pressing herself flat against the glass wall of the boardroom, desperately trying to find a way to escape the violence. The elite, untouchable family image they had spent decades building and aggressively protecting was completely reduced to absolute trash in less than 60 seconds. They were rolling around on the floor of a corporate boardroom, tearing each other apart like wild animals. Charles Kensington stood up, utterly repulsed by the pathetic display, and signaled to his private security to separate them. I sat perfectly still at the head of the mahogany table. I did not flinch at the screaming. I did not look away from the carnage. I calmly picked up my black leather portfolio and handed it to Julian. The flawless execution was finally complete. I had not just defeated them, I had forced them to destroy themselves from the inside out, and I was going to walk away with absolutely everything. Tasha screamed, her designer nails digging into Bradley's suit jacket, punishing him for humiliating her. Bradley desperately shielded his face, slipping on the hardwood floor. Sienna remained pressed flat against the glass wall, weeping hysterically, clutching her stomach as she watched her wealthy future completely evaporate. Charles Kensington stood at the head of the table, raising his hand to signal his security. But his guards never got the chance to pull Tasha off her bleeding husband. The heavy mahogany doors were violently thrust apart. 6 federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets bearing the gold letters of the FBI poured into the suite. They moved with terrifying precision, their boots stomping against the floor, instantly paralyzing everyone in the room. 2 agents flanked the exit, blocking anyone from leaving. The lead agent held up a federal warrant. The sheer authority of the federal presence sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Tasha froze mid-strike. She backed away from her husband, her chest heaving, her styled hair ruined. Bradley scrambled backward on his hands and knees, pressing his back against the base of the table. He looked like a cornered animal, his arrogant privilege useless against the federal badges invading the room. The lead agent locked eyes with Charles Kensington, ignoring the defense attorneys, who had already raised their hands in silent surrender. Kensington gave a single firm nod of compliance. He stepped aside, giving the federal authorities unimpeded access to his failing executives. The lead agent called out Elliot's full legal name, his voice booming with finality. He stated that Elliot was being placed under immediate arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. He then turned his head slightly and called out Bradley's name, citing him as a primary co-conspirator in the massive laundering scheme. 2 agents moved instantly toward Bradley. They hauled the real estate developer up from the floor. Bradley went limp, sobbing openly as the agents forcefully pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut around his wrists echoed in the silent boardroom. Tasha watched her husband being shackled, realizing her entire life of luxury and elite social standing were completely gone. She was married to a federally indicted felon. While Bradley was detained, the lead agent and his partner marched toward Elliot. Elliot was still slumped in his heavy leather chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. He stared at the federal agents with wide, bloodshot eyes, his brain unable to process the catastrophic reality of his situation. The master manipulator, the senior wealth manager, was paralyzed by fear. The agent ordered Elliot to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Elliot did not move. I was hyperventilating, his chest rising and falling in rapid jerks. The agent repeated the command, stepping close enough to physically haul Elliot out of the chair. The threat of physical force finally shattered the last remaining piece of Elliot's mind. He let out a pathetic whine. He scrambled out of his chair, spun around, and threw himself onto the floor, dropping directly to his knees in front of me. He crawled forward, his expensive suit trousers scraping against the polished hardwood. He reached out with shaking, sweaty hands, desperately grabbing the hem of my crisp white suit. He looked up at me, tears and sweat pouring down his flushed face, completely abandoning every single ounce of his pride, his arrogance, and his toxic masculinity. "Valerie, please," Elliot sobbed, his voice cracking horribly. "Please, you have to stop them. You have the power to fix this. You manage these crises every single day. You can talk to the regulators. You can pay the restitution from your offshore accounts. I will give you anything you want. I will sign whatever you put in front of me. I will leave Sienna right now. Please do not let them put me in a federal prison. I will not survive in there." I sat perfectly still, looking down at the man who had brought his mistress to a corporate gala to humiliate me just 48 hours ago. I looked at the man who had laughed in my face, locked me out of my home, and tried to steal my multi-million-dollar empire to fund his cheating lifestyle. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no sadness, not even anger. He was empty to me. "Valerie, I am your husband." Elliot begged, his voice growing frantic as the federal agent stepped up behind him. "We are family. My mother will not survive the public shame of this. You cannot just throw your own family away like this. Please, I am begging you, save me." I slowly reached down and peeled his sweaty, trembling fingers off the pristine white fabric of my suit. I leaned forward, my face just inches from his terrified, tear-stained eyes. The entire boardroom held its breath, waiting for my response. Julian stood tall and immovable right behind my shoulder. I looked Elliot dead in the eyes and delivered the final truth. "Do not overreact, Elliot," I said, my voice echoing with pure, lethal ice. "I am just taking out the trash." Elliot let out a devastated, broken wail. It was the sound of a man watching the gates of hell open up to swallow him whole. I leaned back in my leather chair and gave a polite nod to the federal agent standing behind him. The lead agent grabbed Elliot forcefully by the shoulders, hauling him up from his knees and shoving him against the edge of the mahogany table. Elliot continued to sob uncontrollably as the agent wrenched his arms tightly behind his back. The cold steel of the federal handcuffs snapped forcefully around Elliot's wrists. The sharp click of the locks engaging signaled the absolute permanent end of his life. I watched the agents drag my husband out of the boardroom, knowing I won it all. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut, sealing the fate of the men who thought they could outsmart me. The boardroom remained eerily quiet, the remaining partners too terrified to even breathe in my direction. I did not linger. I picked up my portfolio, nodded respectfully to Charles Kensington, and walked out into the crisp Atlanta morning. The air tasted incredibly sweet. 365 days is a remarkable amount of time when you spend it building an empire instead of fighting for scraps of basic respect. 1 year later, the ashes of Elliot's arrogance had completely settled, revealing the absolute devastation of his choices. He did not get the luxury country club prison he arrogantly assumed his former tax bracket would secure. Elliot is currently serving an 8-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The man who used to throw vicious tantrums over a declined black card now earns 11 cents an hour working in the prison laundry facility, washing the uniforms of men he used to cross the street to avoid. His elite corporate defense attorneys abandoned him. The second the retainer funds dried up, leaving him to face the full, unmitigated wrath of the federal government alone. He sends me letters, sometimes pathetic, tear-stained apologies begging for financial assistance for his commissary account, or pleading for me to speak to the judge. I drop them directly into my office shredder unopened. Bradley's destruction was even more precise. True to my word, I called in the $15 million Vanguard credit loan the very next morning. His commercial real estate portfolio imploded in a matter of days. The banks foreclosed on every single building his grandfather had left him, liquidating his generational wealth to cover the massive gaping deficit. Tasha, desperate to salvage her precious social standing, filed for divorce the moment the news of Bradley's affair with Sienna hit the local blogs. She fought viciously in court for half of his assets, only to discover that half of zero is exactly zero. Tasha lost her luxury vehicles, her high society memberships, and her pride. She tried to attend a charity brunch last month and was politely but firmly turned away at the door by the very women she used to gossip with. She currently lives in a modest, outdated townhouse in the suburbs, entirely cut off from the elite circles she used to terrorize. Vivian's downfall was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. With Elliot in prison and my anonymous charity funding permanently revoked, her philanthropic facade crumbled instantly. The board of directors ousted her in a highly public, humiliating vote, citing financial mismanagement. Without Elliot's stolen income to maintain the massive Buckhead estate, the bank foreclosed on the family mansion. Vivian was formally excommunicated from the Piedmont Driving Club and erased from the Atlanta Black elite. The woman who once mocked my public school upbringing was forced to move into a tiny two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. She now spends her days clipping grocery coupons in a kitchen that smells like cheap bleach, completely isolated, her phone never ringing. Sienna learned the hard way that gold digging is a highly volatile, deeply unforgiving profession. Bradley, facing total bankruptcy and a vicious, highly publicized divorce, completely abandoned her to save his own skin. Elliot, sitting in a jail cell, could offer her nothing but a ruined reputation. She gave birth to Bradley's child in a crowded public hospital, entirely devoid of the luxury maternity suites Elliot had illegally promised her. She is currently working double shifts as a receptionist at a low-end used car dealership, raising a child alone in a cramped rental, forever haunted by the billionaire lifestyle she thought she had secured by destroying another woman's marriage. As for me, I am standing in the exact center of my new reality. The private elevator doors chime, opening directly into my sprawling glass-walled penthouse office, overlooking the magnificent Atlanta skyline. The morning sun catches the gold accents of my custom desk and illuminates the imported marble floors. I am wearing a sharp crimson-tailored suit radiating the kind of absolute, untouchable power that comes from knowing exactly what you are worth and exactly what you are capable of destroying. Julian walks into the office. He is no longer just my assistant or my crisis manager. He is now the chief operating officer of Apex Lifestyle Holdings. He hands me a sleek encrypted digital tablet, a confident knowing smile spreading across his handsome face. He informs me that the quarterly reports have just been finalized and verified. By absorbing the elite clientele who fled Elliot's ruined firm and aggressively expanding our global concierge services, our profit margins have completely tripled. We are no longer just managing the dark money of the elite. We are dictating the financial heartbeat of the entire city, operating completely in the light. I take the tablet, swiping through the massive 8-figure revenue streams. I walk over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the bustling city streets far below. I think about the woman I was 5 years ago, standing in Vivian's dining room, biting my tongue to keep the peace and desperate for acceptance. I think about the woman sitting by the kitchen doors at the charity gala, sipping sparkling water, while her husband paraded his mistress around the VIP section. That woman is gone. The crucible of their betrayal burned away every single ounce of my hesitation, leaving only solid, unbreakable steel. I hand the tablet back to Julian and pick up my steaming cup of artisanal coffee. The view from the top is breathtaking, but it is not the wealth that makes it beautiful. It is the absolute freedom. I built this empire with my own hands, my own intellect, and my own relentless determination. I did not need a wealthy husband to validate my existence, and I certainly did not need his toxic, pretentious family to grant me permission to succeed. I am whole. I am powerful. And as I watch the city wake up under the warm Georgia sun, I know with absolute certainty that I am utterly untouchable. The greatest lesson I learned is that true power never needs to shout. When toxic people underestimate your intelligence and try to strip away your dignity, do not let them see you panic. Build your empire in complete silence, and let their own arrogance become their ultimate downfall. You never owe your loyalty to anyone who treats you like an inconvenience. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship or a family that refused to see your true worth? Tell me your story in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories.